Hello Warriors, this is Mars and welcome to my first Elden Ring build video. This is a tanky lifesteal build that deals a lot of upfront burst damage. This is a full build guide, so I'll be going through stats, equipment, ashes of war, consumables that support, heal, and mitigate damage, spells and incantations including the Wondrous Physic, as well as the Great Room that will bring the build together. I'll also be talking about how to fight larger enemies and how to use the charge effectively against bosses and other enemies of its kind. If you're interested in this type of content, please like and share the video. And if you're looking for more content pertaining to the Elden Ring builds, PvE, and PvP content, then hit that sub button and join my merry band of hardened warriors. It really helps me out, and it helps the channel grow. Let's get into the build, starting with the stats. The build stats consist of 41 Vigor, 19 Mind, 36 Endurance, 45 Strength, 21 Dex, 22 Intelligence, 20 Faith, and 16 Arcane. This build is currently level 120. You can go as high as you want, just make sure you're increasing your vigor as you level to get the most out of your healing, since most if not all of your healing effects on this build scales off of your maximum HP. You also want a considerable amount of endurance and strength as well as mind. This is primarily a strength setup that relies not only on its damage output, but also its resource management and its ability to poise through attacks and mitigate damage quickly. You do need a reasonable amount of faith though for some of the abilities on this build, but you really don't need more than 20. Intelligence is also optional. I mainly have a higher statted intelligence, so I'm able to use all weapon types unrelated to the build. I forgot to mention that I also started as a wretch, so I could distribute my stats evenly. You have the luxury of choosing whichever starting classes you desire. Next, let's move on to equipment. We're using the Great Star with the Prelate's Charge Ash of War in the main hand. I'm running a Fire Enchanted Great Star. The Great Star is the primary damage dealer on this build, due to its massive damage in conjunction with the Prelate's Charge, and it also heals you for 1% of your total HP anytime you deal damage to an enemy. When Prelate's Charge is active, it functions like an AoE, leaving a trail of scorched earth in its wake. The Scorched Earth also counts as the hammer, dealing direct damage to anything that steps into its wake, so that will also heal you. You can run the Great Flame enchant if you are a Faith build, but the regular Flame will function best for Strength builds. Prelate's Charge consumes 7 FP per second, so make sure you have enough mind to manage your resources effectively, as well as having at least 4 Carillion Flasks on standby. The Great Star causes a lot of stagger and has a bleed buildup of 55. So you can get the most out of your DPS by throwing out multiple light attacks followed up by fully charged heavy attacks. The weapon can stagger most enemies in game, just be careful how you use your charge. You have an enormous amount of poise on the initial charge as well as the attack itself, and you can stack that with your gear and other effects, but there are plenty of enemies who can still knock you on your ass, so use it wisely. Prelate's Charge is good for causing stagger and can deal a lot of burst if used correctly. You want to build up that stagger meter by throwing in lights and heavy attacks as well as jumping at heavy attacks. Those have the most stagger damage, but they also have really low recovery time, so make sure you use them on opponents that aren't going to annihilate your health bar while you're stuck in an animation. For my offhand weapons, I use the Bestial Talisman just for the recovery castings like Bestial Vitality and Great Heal. This build relies on all of its healing effects. I have the option of being tanky or focusing on DPS. I utilize some offensive incantations like Flame Sling, Bestial Sling for change-ups, and Magma Breath for AoE burst damage. Using Bestial Sling in conjunction with Magma Breath can true combo into Prelate's Charge, just use it wisely. My next offhand weapon is the Serpent God Fire Curved Sword with a Flame Strike of Ash of War. This is a strength-based curved sword, so it's going to scale more from strength in the end of its life cycle. Honestly, I kind of underestimated its damage output. I didn't anticipate it to have as much stagger damage that it possesses. Combining its fast attacks with the Flame Strike Ash of War, which can also be a true combo with whatever armament you apply it to, makes it a fearsome tool. Primarily, I use it for the healing effect it provides when you dispatch an opponent. You don't even have to be using it, just have it equipped. Specifically how the weapon works. If anything dies not just in the area but in the quadrant, it will heal you for a total of 5% of your maximum health, plus an additional 30 HP. Now keep in mind, this weapon is to compensate for the lack of speed that the Great Star has against faster weapons like birds and dogs, but it also has quite a bit of damage output as well. With a Flame Strike, you can match the damage of the Great Star and build up your stagger through heavy attacks. The last offhand slot has 2 options for either more DPS and resistances, or more survivability and regen. For more DPS and resistance, I use the Commander's Standard. Primarily it can be used for buffing, but it can also be used for damage applications. Why the Commander Standard, you ask? The buff is really too good to pass up. Not to mention it can stack with other damaging and mitigating effects, so you can get crazy with it. The other armament in question is the Icon Shield. It's a great shield with solid mitigations and gives 3 HP per second. Unfortunately, you can't apply any Ashes of War to this weapon, but since it has no skill, you can instantly go into Prelate's Charge without having to 2-hand your Great Star. Next, let's jump into the variety of talismans you can use on this build. For personal preference, I use the Radagon Sword Seal and the Arsenal Charm +1, or the War Jar's Arsenal Charm to give me a bonus to Vigor, Endurance, Dexterity, Strength, and the additional bonus to Equip Load. If you don't want a written Radagon Seal, you can always use Erdtree's Favor +2 for more stat. The third slot is the Godskin Swaddling Cloth. This heals you for 3% of your total HP plus a flat 30 HP when you land 3 to 7 melee hits in succession. As long as you're landing hits within a 10-second window, you will heal. You can use whatever you want in the first 2 slots depending on the weight of your equipment, but the third is mandatory for the additional healing. However, the last slot is the most diverse. A majority of the time, I'm using the Do Bless Talisman for the combined healing with the Icon Shield, Bestial Vitality paired with the Great Star's Prelate's Charge, and the Godskin Swaddling Cloth Talisman. The combined healing makes you pretty tanky as long as you can mitigate the damage. I prefer the Do Bless Talisman for longer boss fights, but when I'm clearing an area, I run the Taker's Cameo, which heals you for 3% of your maximum health plus a 30 HP when you get a kill. This works well in conjunction with the Serpent's Guide Curved Sword and Prelate's Charge. There are a plethora of other talismans that I am keen on trying, like the Claw Talisman, but for maximum damage output, I mainly use the Rotted Winged Sword Insignia. I really like the Rotted Winged Sword Insignia because of its damage stacking effects with the Prelate's Charge and other damage stacking effects. You can experiment as you see fit on this build. Next, let's go into consumables. So there are a plethora of ways to continue to buff the build's damage and mitigations through consumables. On this build, I use the Mimic as my summon. As long as the Mimic doesn't get staggered too much, it can pretty much clear a room practically on its own. A lot of the consumables work in conjunction with the Mimic, and I specifically built my consumables in mind of what will keep the Mimic alive longer, and give both the summon and I good team cohesion. If you primarily want to focus on utility for you and your Mimic, the boiled crab meat and uplifting aromatic is what you need on your build. The crab meat will increase your physical damage negation by 20% for 1 minute, and the aromatic will give you a 10% damage bonus to you and your allies in the vicinity for 30 seconds, including 90% damage negation until you take damage. I'd reserve your aromatic for your Mimic since they will use it at the most opportunistic times. You can use throwable items, but I'd suggest not too many or any at all because if you plan to use your Mimic, those items can mess with their AI. I also advise equipping but never using the raw meat dumpling. This is only for the Mimic so they can heal and survive for longer periods of time. Most importantly, let's talk about the wondrous physics and your options. For the first slot, you have the option of running the Carillion Hidden Tier, which eliminates all FP costs for skills, spells, and incantations, or the Crimson Crystal Tier for an additional heal over time to stack with your other healing effects. Those are the resource-focused statuses. In terms of damage status effects, go for either the Strength and Not Crystal Tier if you want to buff all your physical damage abilities as well as your physical defense, since Strength governs your physical resistances, or you can focus solely on increasing your fire damage by using the Flame Shotted Crack Tier. Both of these work well in conjunction with the Commander's Standard buff and the Rotted Winged Sword Insignia, easily pushing you past 1k physical damage if your Great Star is plus 25 with at least 40 strength in your build. Those are just the ones that I have enjoyed using thus far, but experiment as much as you like. Nothing is set in stone, and you could potentially find something much more powerful. Just be sure to let me know what you find out. Lastly, before we talk about gameplay, let's jump into the Great Rune. In terms of Great Rune, I primarily use Godric's and Radahn's Great Rune, which gives you more stat across the board, which is pretty solid. You have a lot more survivability, you're tankier, and you can deal a lot more damage. But Malenia's Great Rune will heal you nearly 30% of your maximum HP, if not more, when you retaliate against an opponent that has damaged you. The only trade-off with Malenia's Rune is that your flask is not as efficient, and you won't heal for as much when you go to heal. So, take that as you will. Make sure you try out multiple Great Runes, see what works for your build, and what's going to work for your playstyle. Now let's talk about gameplay mechanic before we wrap this up. Like I said earlier in the video, your primary DPS tool is the Great Star's Prelate charge, but it's not your only DPS tool. Make sure you're weaving in heavy attacks as well as your fully charged heavy attacks to build up stagger damage. Light attacks are your basic attacks, and they also build stagger damage. You also want to integrate jumping attacks against larger enemies that don't stagger easily. However, you need to be careful because some enemies will not stagger easily and are very willing to trade blows with you. I'm talking about Crucible Knights. Do not take them lightly, they will kill you. Crucible Knights can be staggered by the Prelate's charge's release, but it won't knock them down unless they've taken a lot of consistent staggering attacks. The Banished Knights in Farum Azula also function in a similar manner. Be mindful how you use your charge as well. Some instances you will need to use it sparingly, in others that needs to be the only skill you're using against any type of enemy. Some enemies can't take a lot of stagger. There are some bosses that are like that, and you can use that to your advantage, but don't let that be the only thing you use. You are not invincible. Prelate's charge is a lot of poise, so you can take most hits, just don't get too crazy. Well, that's the end of the build guide for Prelate's charge. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll probably be making more Elden Ring videos along the way, alongside other content on the channel, so if you're interested, please join my merry band of hardened warriors by hitting that sub button, or just liking or sharing the video. Again, thanks for watching, and keep on slaying. Peace.